Stalkers, The Dead Zone. Chapter 1. If I only knew. If I had known how things would turn out, I would never have dragged my friends there. Never in my life would I have ventured into this cursed place, would not have allowed us to step into its gloomy confines. We have been through a lot together, those whom I have always considered the most reliable and courageous company. We faced the frightening. We made our way to where every experienced tracker could only dream of being. But we always returned home, as if all this was just another page of an adventure. It was difficult to surprise or scare us. We've seen a lot, that's what I thought. And I still remember how our previous meetings were filled with laughter, banter, and an indescribable feeling of freedom. We were like a single organism, driven by one thirst, to explore, to learn, to come face to face with the unknown. Each of us, me, Jack, Sam, Tom, and Ben, were like brothers with whom we were ready to share our last strength, and it seemed that nothing could change that. But now I know I was wrong. He's been wrong since the moment he started this sortie. My confidence turned into a tragedy, and I can't forget those looks of horror, the fear chilling their faces in the last moments. If I could go back to the past. Chapter 2. A New Place. I admit, when I first heard about Pripyat, this idea cut into my mind like a bone dagger. The abandoned city, pinned to the ground by a load of radiation and silence, seemed to be the last frontier for us stalkers. This place promised not just fear or risk, but something more primal, something that slipped out of time, frozen between the past and the present. An ancient wound left after a disaster known to the whole world. A ghost town, a place where life itself stopped. We've been dreaming about him for a long time. We were secretly discussing it, as if we had a chance to be there before anyone else. Pripyat is the real test. The idea that our feet would step on the deserted streets of a city that was once bustling with life attracted me like a drug. To imagine oneself among buildings engulfed in the shadow of radiation was mesmerizing and terrifying overnight. Where everything is quiet, where nature and mutations rule, strange rumors live. I have heard stories about mutated animals, the very creatures that were affected by decades of radiation, about how they became not only changed, but also doomed to exist among the ruins of the city. People talked about snakes with triple jaws, about birds with multiple pairs of eyes, but these were just rumors. Or not. These eerie images filled my thoughts, haunted my dreams. Mutations, twisted creations of radiation, something out there beyond my understanding, was calling me. I wanted to see it all with my own eyes, to feel the oppressive silence that Pripyat breathes, to find out if it was true that the dead were still waiting, hidden behind a curtain of destroyed houses and rubble. Chapter 3. The Call of the Five. When the decision finally matured, there was only one thing left in my head: how to share it with friends. Pripyat, the greatest challenge that we have always longed for. On this sunny day, I felt that all doubts had melted away, leaving only longing. I picked up the phone and started calling our five. Sam answered the phone first. When he heard the word Pripyat, he was silent for a few seconds, but then a note of delight mixed with a slight tremor appeared in his voice. "Are you serious, buddy?" he finally said. "Are we really going to do this?" His voice trembled with impatience, and I knew he agreed. Then there was Tom. As always, he was skeptical about the idea, but I knew deep down he couldn't refuse. For him, every outing was an opportunity to challenge himself, and although he said it was crazy, his voice betrayed his zeal. In the end, he exhaled, "Okay, I'm with you. Who else can support us?" Ben, who answered next, reacted with childish joy. He had always been an adventure hunter, and the idea of an abandoned city delighted him. He couldn't wait to get to a place where there were no police, no people, just us and a ghost town. The last one was Jack. He was always a little more careful than others, but this time he couldn't resist either. Perhaps he felt that this was not just another adventure, but something more special, entailing an invisible danger. But this danger only added to his excitement. We agreed to meet to discuss the details. Our small bar, a secluded place where future outings were always discussed, became lively again when we got together. Everyone brought their own excitement, their own tension and anticipation, as if they already felt the cold breath of Pripyat slowly creeping up to us. Chapter 4. Preparing for Departure. When the day of departure arrived, I was determined. Our preparations were not going as usual. Everything was more detailed, precise. We had to face something different than the abandoned buildings or crumbling mansions that we had explored before. Pripyat required a different approach. Each of us took on a part of the tasks. We collected maps, studied reports on radiation levels, and found out which places to avoid. We knew that we were entering a zone where the slightest mistake could turn into a tragedy. Radiation protection suits, reliable Geiger counters, first aid kits, provisions, and tools. We prepared all this carefully, realizing that our lives were at stake. It was necessary to fly across the ocean. On the evening before departure, we met at the airport. Each of us had mixed feelings of anticipation and slight anxiety. Ben, cheerful as always, made fun of our serious faces. Sam discussed with Tom how long the trip would take, and Jack checked over and over again to make sure he hadn't forgotten something important. Despite the excitement, there was a slight smile on our faces. We were a team. We were together. The flight flew by like a flash. The feeling of unreality only intensified as they approached the place, which was enveloped in a thick aura of mystery. After landing, we rented a car, loaded up our gear, and hit the road. The road was long, but the views around, calm forests, distant fields, enhanced the feeling of approaching something ancient and inaccessible. As we made our way deeper and deeper, leaving the noisy world of civilization behind, the tension in the air became palpable. The closer we got to the city, the more the silence thickened around us. It felt like we were leaving for another world, leaving behind everything familiar. Ahead of us was the unknown and the silence of Pripyat, which hides countless secrets. Chapter 5. The Road to Pripyat. As usual, I got the driver's seat. Sam, Tom, Ben, and Jack were comfortably ensconced, each immersed in their own thoughts, which were reflected on their faces. Ben was animatedly photographing landscapes, as if already anticipating the shots he would be able to take in an abandoned city. And Sam was flipping through a map on his phone, checking the road. The road seemed to be an endless ribbon winding through dormant forests, fields, and sparse villages. We were making our way deeper into a land not meant for life. The silence, barely broken by the sound of the engine, reinforced the feeling that we were moving towards something inevitable. The calm light of the sun played on the glass, but there was a strange heaviness in the air, as if nature itself was preparing for what would happen next. As we approached the outskirts of the exclusion zone, the landscape also changed. The road became more deserted, the trees taller and thicker. A light breeze stirred the tops of the pines, but gave the impression of some kind of gloomy whisper, as if warning us. We drove in silence. Everyone seemed to be trying to capture this feeling. The realization that the place we were heading to was dead in itself, but not completely. The sun was gradually sinking towards the horizon when we finally saw the first sign. Pripyat was not far away. The closer we got, the more alien everything around us became. Houses, gray and empty, flickered in the field of vision like sparse shadows. The city was very close. Chapter 6. Penetration. We drove up to the border of Pripyat, where a massive, battered fence surrounded the territory, leaving it imprisoned. It wasn't easy to get in here, and we knew it. The plan was to park the car away from the main entrance and continue on foot. It was an illegal invasion, but no one in our 5 objected. We all knew why we had come. Leaving the car behind the trees, we prepared the equipment and checked the tools. It seemed to me that my heart was beating too loudly, not even out of fear, but out of tension about what awaits us next. We all understood that we needed not only to get through security, but also to get deep into the city, past empty buildings and streets where no human has set foot for decades. We found information about workarounds on the internet, but these were just rumors. The first route turned out to be unsuccessful. The guards controlled the entrance and we saw them from afar. Hiding in the shade of the trees, we stopped and looked at each other. No one wanted to run into the police or be detained. Leaving the first path behind, we walked around the area and decided to try another route. The second way turned out to be more successful. We came across an old part of the fence hung with barbed wire, but there were no guards here. We had wire cutters with us, and Ben quickly got down to business. While waiting, I looked back at my friends. Everyone was intently watching his actions, and I could feel their wave of excitement and anxiety. The wire gave way, and, slipping through the hole, we found ourselves on the territory of Pripyat. When my feet set foot on this earth, I felt everything around me quiet down. The ghost town opened up before us, silent and motionless, like a scene from a forgotten dream. Chapter 7. The first steps in Pripyat. We stood holding our breath, looking around. It was like in another reality. Everything around seemed frozen, dead, and at the same time somehow mysterious. The sun was already sinking towards the horizon, flooding the streets with a dim orange light, and the shadows from abandoned buildings stretched out, forming ominous outlines. We moved forward, carefully picking our way through cracks in the asphalt, through thickets and debris. Our footsteps broke the silence, reminding us that we were the only living souls here. The path was unfamiliar, but every turn beckoned us forward. It took us deeper, away from reality, where we could go back. A few minutes later, we came across another fence surrounding the buildings. In the distance, Tom could hear the faint crackle of the Geiger counter that hung on his belt. Sam whispered, "This thing sets the atmosphere, doesn't it?" We all grinned, but it was clear that it was more nervous laughter than joy at the situation. Finally, after passing through a narrow passage in the wall, we found ourselves on an empty street, surrounded by tall buildings that seemed to be watching us with their empty windows. The city was dark, lifeless, but we couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone or something was watching us from these gloomy shadows. Chapter 8. The Silence of the Dead City. We went deeper and deeper, and with each step the city seemed to squeeze us in its arms. From every abandoned building, from every broken window, there was something ancient, invisible, but no less tangible. This city, which was once bustling with life, was now engulfed by nature and time. There were signs of destruction everywhere, Broken stairs, empty window openings, sidewalks overgrown with moss and grass. I looked at my friends. There was the same horror mixed with admiration in their eyes that I had. Ben walked beside him, whispering softly to himself, "This is not just a place. It's like another world." Jack nodded in agreement and added, "It's like everything is frozen in anticipation here. It's like someone is still living here, hiding from us behind these walls." Our footsteps and the occasional crackle of the Geiger counter were the only sounds breaking the frightening silence. I could clearly feel how each of us was trying not to think about what we were seeing and hearing, but no one could avoid it. It seemed that the city was breathing, listening to us, catching our every move. The sun was setting, and the shadows were getting longer and the streets were getting darker. We reached the central square, and in front of us opened a view of a rusty carousel, as if frozen forever in an instant. This sight chilled us to the bone. We all felt the same way. Something much more terrible than just a disaster had happened here. Sam, in a trembling voice, said, "Maybe that's enough? Maybe we should leave before it's too late." But none of us answered. We were too deep inside, both in the city and in our desire to find out what was hiding behind these walls. Chapter 9. The First Oddities. As we walked through the deserted streets, the silence around us became almost palpable. All senses were heightened to the limit, and the slightest rustle made us slow down, freeze in place. Suddenly, Ben, who was walking a little ahead, stopped and gestured somewhere to the side. We followed his gaze and saw what made us wary. In the distance, between the shadows, the figure of an animal flashed. It was a dog. We only saw him for a moment before he disappeared into the depths of the abandoned buildings. His silhouette seemed strange to me, as if unnaturally elongated and disfigured, but it could just be a play of shadows. We looked at each other, and I realized that I wasn't the only one who noticed it. Everyone had a strange feeling that something was wrong with this dog, but no one said a word, and we moved on, leaving it behind us as a vague echo of the horror that we had yet to understand. We came to an old high-rise building. The 5-story building stood like a watchman guarding oblivion and ruins. Looking at him, I felt that now we would touch the very heart of the abandoned city, its secrets. We stepped inside and felt an oppressive cold pressing down on us. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. This high-rise building was like a museum of the past, forever locked up in the 80s. Old posters on the walls, rusty pipes, broken furniture. Everything spoke of the life that once bubbled here, and now, as if pressing a pause, froze in silence. I peered into every corner, as if hoping to find something that would tell me about this stopped era, but instead I felt only emptiness. We all stood in silence, not saying a word, realizing that behind these walls there was forever a life that no longer exists. Tom, in a whisper, so as not to disturb this strange atmosphere, said, "You feel as if time has stopped, as if everything disappeared in an instant, and now it's all just waiting." We nodded silently, continuing to explore the rooms and corridors, making our way deeper into the darkness of an abandoned world where every step seemed to touch someone else's long-gone life. Chapter 10. Crackling Radiation. Moving further along the corridors of the building, we began to hear the amplified crackle of the Geiger counter. This sound, at first rare and barely distinguishable, became more and more frequent. Tom, holding the device in front of him, gave us a quick glance. The radioactive background is growing. We're in a safe zone, but it's better to be on your guard. The crackle of the meter became the background. some kind of ominous reminder of the invisible threat that surrounded us everywhere. Every time it intensified, I felt goosebumps running over my skin. The silence of the dead city, the strange distorted sounds coming from the meter, created a tension that seemed almost unbearable. We were wearing suits that protected us from radiation, but the feeling of danger was real, as if this place was trying to kick us out. We kept moving, carefully checking every step, every staircase. Concrete walls covered with cracks and rust spots towered around us, and the meter crackled and crackled, as if warning us that Pripyat did not want guests. And the further we went, the more noticeable this strange tension became. Sam muttered nervously, "I feel like someone is watching us. This place, it's alive." His words echoed in my mind, and I suddenly felt scared. Something here, within these walls, was hiding and watching our every move, waiting. Chapter 11. Something in the store. We turned a corner and an abandoned store opened up in front of us. As soon as we noticed it, we decided to go inside. We wanted to take a look at what was left of this place, which was probably bustling with life once. Treading carefully on the floor, strewn with broken glass and rusty debris, we entered the semi-darkness, where there were no shelves or goods left, only emptiness and the hollow echo of our footsteps. We were looking around the room when Ben took a step forward and stopped abruptly. I noticed his posture and froze after him. On the opposite side of the store, in the corner, something was moving. It was a cat, or something that resembled a cat. But it immediately became clear that this creature is far from our understanding of pets. It was something distorted, crooked, a mutant, the product of years of radiation exposure. Her muzzle was deformed, one side of her muzzle was swollen, and her eyes were two different sizes, one of which sparkled with a sick yellowness, almost as if it glowed in the dark. The animal's jaw was twisted so that the lower lip hung down, exposing rows of sharp, crooked teeth, and saliva flowed from the corner of the mouth, dripping onto the floor. We all froze, startled by this eerie sight. I felt a shudder run through my body, and I saw that my friends were in the same state. Jack whispered, "What is this?" His voice trailed off as several kittens joined the distorted cat. Small creatures with outstretched paws and ugly, deformed bodies, they seemed more like demons than kittens. Sam backed away, covering his mouth with his hand in disgust and fright. We couldn't take our eyes off this scene, despite the fact that it penetrated to the depths of our soul. Horror, overnight with insane pity for these animals. These creatures stood and looked at us as if they didn't understand what we were doing here. But there was something frightening, wary in their gaze. I felt my heart pounding more and more, and finally whispered, "We'd better leave." No one objected. We quickly turned around and left the store, leaving this creepy image behind. In the silence, I felt the air around me become even heavier, and my thoughts were confused from the tension and fear that began to creep into my consciousness. Chapter 12. The station is ahead. Leaving the store and its ugly inhabitants behind, we moved on in silence. None of us said a word. Everyone needed time to digest what they saw. But I knew that our gazes kept returning to thoughts of that distorted, creepy cat and her kittens, whom radiation had turned into ghosts of their own existence. Some time passed, and finally, the main goal of our trip appeared on the horizon. The massive building of the nuclear power plant, whose silhouette towered over the rest of the buildings like a silent witness to that terrible disaster. It looked like a monolith, a huge thing, motionless and unshakable. Its black, empty windows stared at us like dead eyes, and the whole structure exuded an oppressive sense of danger. The Geiger counter relentlessly warned of danger. The crackling became much louder. We were closely monitoring the indicators. The radiation background was rising with every step, but our suits, we hoped, protected us. Tom looked nervously at me, then at the device, and when he heard the rapid crackling, his face turned pale. "This is off the charts," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. I realized that the others were also wary. The radiation level we were approaching was above all expectations. However, no one took a step back. We came here to see everything with our own eyes, and we had no intention of stopping, even in the face of this monster of radiation. We moved on, every cell of our body feeling fear and determination at the same time. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt. It seemed that the very space around the station was thick, saturated with an invisible force. I heard Jack exhale softly, as if a shadow had enveloped him. Not a physical one, but almost at the level of instincts. He looked at us and nodded, indicating that he was ready to move on, but his eyes spoke of doubts. Nevertheless, we continued on our way, peering at the formidable bulk of the station, which stood before us, mute and unyielding. Chapter 13. Creatures of Darkness. We were moving on, approaching the station, when suddenly everyone felt an abrupt stop. No one said a word, but each of us felt something cold and ominous looming over us. Against the background of the booming crackle of the Geiger counter, we heard a muffled rustle. I turned around and saw something that made me go cold with horror. A dog came around the far corner of the building, only it wasn't an ordinary animal. The creature that appeared in front of us was something much more terrifying. Huge, with a distorted body, twisted paws, and skin covered with dull fur. This dog looked as if radiation had not only changed him physically, but also given him an appearance completely alien and unnatural. His head was disproportionately large, and his eyes were on different sides of his skull, as if the creature did not have the slightest resemblance to a dog's appearance. We froze, paralyzed by fear. Sam, who was standing next to me, was breathing heavily, and I saw him slowly step back without taking his eyes off this creature. But our fear increased even more when others came around the corner. First one, then another and another, and soon there was a whole flock in front of us. Distorted, wild creatures that froze, looking at us with empty, as if devoid of life, eyes. I felt my blood run cold. We stood there, not knowing what to do. Run away? Scream? But fear paralyzed us. Sam finally whispered, "Shall we shout and they'll run away?" But we knew that shouting would only make them angry. It was a mistake, and when Sam plucked up the courage to step forward and start screaming, these creatures bared their crooked, disfigured teeth. Their eyes glittered with aggression. The pack began to slowly approach. I've seen their faces contort into creepy grimaces, vicious and unnatural. We started shouting louder, trying to scare them away, but it only made the situation worse. They were getting closer, surrounding us, and we realized that running was the only way out. I turned to the others and shouted. We rushed back to the building, stumbling and falling as the creatures raced after us, baring their sharp teeth. Jack was the last and did not have time to dodge. One of the creatures grabbed his leg. We jumped up and, kicking, dragged him into the building, leaving terrible footprints on the threshold. Jack was losing his strength, and we realized that we had almost no time left to save ourselves. Chapter 14. The Last Frontier. The door behind which we hid was old and covered with rust, but we hoped that it would withstand the onslaught of this terrible pack. Holding on with the last of our strength, Ben and I propped her up while Tom and Sam tried to help Jack. Jack was turning pale in front of his eyes. His face was distorted with pain, and every minute counted. Sam rummaged through his backpack and finally found a first aid kit. He applied a tourniquet, but the wound was deep and ragged, and it seemed that the tourniquet did little to help. Jack screamed in pain, and his moans filled the empty building, echoing through the empty corridors like crying in the night. Suddenly, we heard a hoarse, wild roar from the other side of the door. The creatures persistently tried to break through, clawing at old wood and pieces of sheathing. I felt goosebumps run through my body. Fear squeezed us more and more, turning every minute into torture. Tom looked back at us and said in an anxious voice, "This door won't hold. We must find another way out." We realized that there was little time left. Our suits were already exhausted by radiation, and the situation was getting more dangerous. Leaving one of us outside the door to keep up the pressure, we started looking for a way out. Sam and I ran down the hall, peering into the empty rooms. It seemed that the air around was thickening with fear, and every dark corner hides even more dangers. Jack was lying on the floor. His heavy breathing seemed more and more ragged, and we continued to frantically search for a way to escape. Chapter 15. Irreversible Losses. The wild roar outside the door intensified, and looking at each other, we realized we didn't have time. Leaning against the walls, Sam and I made our way further down the corridor, hoping to find at least some way to escape, while Tom and Ben held the door with their last strength, trying to contain this desperate onslaught. Jack, pale as a sheet, slowly left us. I understood and knew that with every minute his strength was fading. The screeching became shrill, and suddenly the door began to crack, sounding louder and louder, like the moan of an agonizing creature. At one point, she just crumbled, and the pack rushed in. The monsters swooped in with unimaginable fury, their animal faces twisted in ugly grimaces. In a panic, we all rushed to the back exit, pulling Jack with the last of our strength. But he could barely move. The wound was too serious. I looked at him, realizing that time was running out, and suddenly I felt like he was just torn out of my hands by a violent force. Jack's weak, pained look was the last thing we saw. His screams echoed through the corridors. I was terrified, frantic and desperate, and clenching my teeth, barely holding back tears, I had to continue running with the others. Ben screamed, "Let's run before they catch up with us." The terrible sounds and screams of Jack remained in my head. We ran on without looking back, driven only by fear. Chapter 16. Panic and Despair. We rushed deep into the abandoned building without turning around, but we knew that these creatures were still chasing us. At every step, at every turn, I felt their presence, hungry, ruthless, breathing down our necks. We ducked into a room and slammed the door behind us. This time, the door was stronger, and we propped it up with old shelves and pieces of furniture. But we knew it wouldn't last long. We all collapsed on the floor, exhausted to the limit. Tom, burying his face in his hands, whispered through his trembling, "Jack is no more. How is this even possible?" His face was distorted with pain and despair, and there were tears in his eyes. I knew he couldn't accept that we had lost Jack, but I didn't have the strength to support him. I also couldn't believe it and realize it with pain in my soul. Sam was breathing heavily, sitting on the floor, his hands shaking so much that he couldn't hold them. He pressed himself against the wall, clinging to it like a drowning man, and looking at one point repeated in a trembling voice, "Why? Why is this happening? What kind of hell is this?" His voice seemed barely audible, but with every second there was more fear in it. It seemed to me that the reality around me began to distort. This room, our temporary shelter, was empty. The walls were scuffed, cobwebs in the corners. The air was heavy and musty. With every breath I took, I could smell the fear. It seemed to penetrate into the lungs and paralyze us from the inside. I sat down next to Tom and closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing heart. Why did I take this trip? Why did you take your friends here? I was filled with guilt, despair, and fear, and every heartbeat only intensified this pain. Chapter 17. Leadership on the Edge. I was sitting on the floor, lost in my thoughts, and all the sensations were mixed up in one, a dull feeling of horror. I was the leader of this group, and now that we were trapped, I felt like responsibility was binding me like invisible chains. We lost Jack, and each of us realized that we could have been in his place. Fear and anxiety were so tightly intertwined that it was sometimes difficult to breathe. Sam was trembling and muttering incoherently. His face looked painfully pale. He didn't take his eyes off the door, as if he was afraid that the monsters would burst in at any moment. Tom, sitting in the corner, sobbed softly, occasionally peering at me. There was a distinct reproach and confusion in his gaze. He couldn't understand why we decided to do this. Even Ben, who had always been the most cheerful of us, now looked lost and depressed. I forced myself to speak, to somehow awaken them from their paralyzing terror. "We're going to get out of here," I said, trying to put a firmness in my voice that I didn't feel myself. "We have to get together and figure out how to leave. Let's calm down and think about it." My words sounded empty, but they seemed to help bring back some clarity. Ben nodded, trying to look brave, and Sam just closed his eyes and began to breathe deeper, trying to hold back the tears. Tom whispered, "You know we might not be coming back, right?" I met his gaze, not knowing what to say. All my plans, my confidence, and my thirst for adventure collapsed like a house of cards. I felt the growing fear and responsibility pressing down on me, turning my thoughts into chaos. But if I break down now, my friends will be left alone. I had to be strong, at least for them. Chapter 18. Animal Tracks. An hour later, when the trembling began to let go, we all gradually calmed down. Leaving the tears and fear behind, we knew we needed to act. I forced myself to stand up and slowly looked around the room, trying to find at least the slightest opportunity to exit. There was a smell of fear and sweat in the air, mixed with the mustiness of the old walls, and it made us feel trapped. Suddenly, an ominous growl broke the silence. Scary, loud, shrill to the point of horror. It sounded from somewhere outside, as if the beast was very close, and with each sound his heart stopped. Sam looked at me with frightened eyes and whispered, "They found us. Damn it, they found us." There was not a drop of hope in his voice, only pure horror. We froze, listening. Claws hit the door, and we heard the animals scratching at it, scratching, trying to get to us. The sound was unbearable, as if someone was trying to open our nerves right on the surface of our skin. Sam began to cry, muttering incoherently and stepping back. Tom stood motionless, as if paralyzed by fear, and Ben, clenching his teeth, cursed viciously. "We can't stay here," I said as firmly as I could, even though I was torn apart inside. We had to get out while this door was still holding. Suddenly, I noticed a tiny window in the corner. It was low from the floor, covered with a grate, but it looked like you could squeeze through it if you made an effort. I pointed to the window and said, "This is our chance." We rushed to the window and, giving in to panic, began to pull the bars with all our might, ignoring the crackling and grinding on the other side of the door. At some point, I heard one of the door panels crack. They were breaking through. Chapter 19. Escape into the darkness. We all leaned on the grate, and fortunately, the metal, yielding to our efforts, began to bend. The old cracked walls that crumbled in old age gave us hope. Each of us tore and pulled with all our might, leaving scratches on our hands, ignoring the pain. The crackling from the other side of the door grew louder. The sound of claws scratching wood grew louder, and every second we felt them getting closer. In the end, the grill broke off, and we wasted no time getting out through the window. I was the first to squeeze out, feeling the icy night air hit my face. Leaning forward, I helped the others out until Sam and Ben were next to me. Only Tom remained inside, lingering, still looking back at the door. "Tom, hurry up!" I shouted in desperation. He rushed to the window, but as soon as he tried to get through, the door finally gave way. We heard a wild roar and heavy footsteps approaching him. Tom, clenching his teeth with all his might, broke free from the embrace of the window and fell to the ground, barely getting up. But something even more terrible was waiting for us on the street. We froze, crushed by fear when we saw him, a terrible mutant, disfigured beyond recognition. His torso resembled something not natural, elongated with extra limbs and monstrous distorted features. The creature froze, its eyes filled with malice, staring straight at us. And at that moment, we realized that the only way out was to escape. I screamed. We all rushed away, rushing into the darkness, hearing the blood-curdling roar and trampling rushing after us. Chapter 20. Race for Survival. We ran with all our might, not looking back, desperately biting into every second of life that we could still win. Darkness enveloped us, and the only landmarks were the barely discernible outlines of old buildings thrown at the mercy of radiation and time. Our legs were weak, our breath was lost, but we continued to rush, not daring to slow down even for a moment. Everyone knew that if you stopped, you were next. I heard Tom stumbling somewhere nearby, and I grabbed his arm, helping him keep his balance. I shouted hoarsely, trying not to show how I was on the verge of exhaustion. Ben, pale and out of breath, led Sam a little ahead, but from time to time he looked back to make sure that we were still together. There were footsteps and roars behind him. This mutant did not lag behind. His footsteps sounded closer and closer. Every blow of his paws on the ground echoed in my head, reminding me of a death sentence. We found ourselves in a narrow alley, its walls creating an echo, amplifying every sound. And it gave us the feeling that the beast was already on our heels. Sam, who was running ahead, suddenly stopped and, pointing with his hand, shouted, "This way!" There was a dilapidated building in front of us, its entrance gaping like a black mouth. But there was no other way out. We ran inside, stumbling over debris and rubble, and immediately groped for the massive doors. Without thinking, I slammed them shut, and leaning on them with my whole body, tried to hold them. We stood in total darkness, panting and listening to the silence. There was a roar outside. We pressed ourselves against the wall, trying to calm our pounding hearts. But inside I knew that this creature would not back down. Chapter 21. Darkness beyond the door. We stood in the pitch darkness, pressed against the cold, damp walls, feeling the animal fear devour our last strength. The whole world outside the door seemed unreal, like a nightmare from which one could not wake up. The mutant outside was roaring furiously and clawing at the walls of the building, the sounds resounding like death cries from the other world. It seemed to me that every screech shook the walls, making everything tremble. Sam was down on the floor, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking, and he was muttering incoherently. His nervous trembling was transmitted to everyone, and Tom also began to sob softly, his eyes darting around the dark room in search of a way out. Ben was a little more confident, although I could see that fear had completely taken over him. He whispered, "They won't leave. We are trapped." I tried to keep my composure, but my head was empty. Panic was building, my heart was clenching in my chest, and the air seemed to be getting denser. We were stuck in this abandoned building, surrounded on all sides by creatures that could not be scared off or killed. And with every blow, every rustle outside the door, I felt this darkness devouring us, digging into our souls, depriving us of our will. Suddenly there was silence. Everyone froze, listening, but there was no sound outside. These creatures have disappeared, or perhaps they are just hiding. We couldn't know for sure, and that only increased the horror. In the silence that followed, I caught a heavy, steady breathing that came from somewhere outside, as if an invisible being was inhaling and exhaling in time with our hearts. I knew it wasn't the end. Chapter 22. Confrontation with Horror. The silence was unbearable, as if the darkness itself had thickened around us and absorbed any sounds. We stood there, not daring to move, listening to the slow, ominous breathing outside the walls. That breathing grew louder, as if the creature was getting closer, and each of us knew that whatever it was aware of our presence. Suddenly, a powerful blow rang out. The walls trembled and the floor seemed to give way under my feet. The creature hit the wall again, and it cracked as if it was about to crumble. I rushed to Sam and Tom, pushing them to the back of the room, and Ben was already instinctively looking for something to prop up the doors with. But each blow was more powerful than the previous one, and it seemed that the strength of the building would not stand for a long time. We noticed that there was another passage in front of us, leading somewhere further into the building. The path led to the basement, and we had no choice. Ben gestured to the passage, and I quickly led the group forward. We ran into a dark corridor without looking back, and the walls were still shaking from the blows of the creature outside. After passing through the corridor, we found ourselves in another room, gloomy, narrow, full of debris and dust. I looked at my friends. Each of us was on the verge of exhaustion, but we understood that staying put would be death. This thing won't stop until it finds us. Sam, still panicking, whispered, "She'll find us. She's just playing with us." His words sounded terrifyingly true. This creature knew that we were trapped and slowly, painfully approached us, plunging us into the abyss of fear. Chapter 23. The Monster of Radiation. We stood in the dim basement, trying to freeze as best we could and not make a sound. Even our breathing seemed to give us away. It seemed as if darkness had gathered around us, enveloping us in a dense cocoon of horror. But it wasn't the silence that scared us. It was clear that something huge and sinister already knew about our presence. There was another crash, and suddenly the door shattered in front of us. We stood stunned by this explosion of power, unable to move. A figure appeared in the doorway. It was a bear, not just a bear. It was a killing machine created by radiation and time. He stood there, monstrous and distorted, huge and ugly, with disfigured skin covered with sores and wounds. His muscles were supernaturally developed, and his muzzle looked more like a nightmare than anything real. The monster took a step forward, and I felt the ground tremble under his heavy tread. His eyes were filled with wild rage, and his ugly mouth opened slightly, revealing huge, sharp fangs. I saw Tom start to back away, his face distorted with horror, his legs buckling. I shouted, but it was too late. The monster rushed forward with terrifying speed, and before I realized what was happening, it hit Tom with its paw with such force that he flew several meters away, hitting the wall. We all froze in disbelief, but this creature seemed to be just starting its bloody game. Sam couldn't help but scream, and I tried to pull him into the hallway with me, but he froze, as if paralyzed by horror. The bear turned its head, staring at Sam as if assessing him. He raised his clawed paw and delivered a fatal blow. Sam was gone. At the same moment, something inside me broke down forever. Ben gave me a look full of insane fear. There was despair, fear and pain in it. Hopelessness. We rushed with all our might. It's a nightmare. Chapter 24. Escape from the inevitable. I ran like I had never run before. My feet barely felt the ground, and only madness drove me forward, while despair was beating inside. It was just me and Ben, and the realization pierced me with pain. All those who were with me, my friends, my team, they were gone. And if it wasn't for the animal instinct of survival, I probably would have collapsed right where I was standing. We raced through abandoned corridors, dodging obstacles and looking back at every sound. The wind whistled through the empty windows, and the sound mixed with the distant roar of the monster, which was getting quieter. It might have temporarily lost our trail, but I knew it would find us again, and we didn't have much time left. Running out of the building, we found ourselves in an open square in front of the station. There was only darkness around, broken by the occasional glimmer of the moon. It seemed that the very air here was saturated with fear and death. We ran and ran through old and ruined houses, alleys, turns. We just ran like never before. The adrenaline was pumping. Normally, we would have fallen long ago, but not now. Finally, I noticed lights in the distance. It was one of the old security posts that we came across at the entrance to the zone. I shouted, pointing at the lights. He nodded, and we rushed there as if our lives depended on it. And so it was. Every step was given with great difficulty. My legs felt like cotton wool, and my head was spinning from exhaustion and despair. Only one thing kept us going. The hope that by reaching the post we would be safe, that they would hear us and help us get out of this hell. And so, when we finally approached the fence of the post, I felt my strength leave me. When I got there, I fell on my knees in front of the guards and tried to say something, but only a wheeze escaped me. Ben also fell down next to him. His face was white, and there was a look of horror in his eyes. One of the guards hurried over to us, and before I lost consciousness, I heard him ask, "What happened to you? Who are you?" Chapter 25. Consequences. I woke up in a hospital room, blinded by a bright light. The first thing I felt was debilitating exhaustion, as if my body was completely drained. Memories whirled through my head, but reality seemed as hazy as the dream I'd just been snatched from. Looking around, I noticed that the guard from the zone was sitting next to me, the one who found Ben and me. His face was thoughtful, as if he was trying to piece together what we had told him. Catching my eye, he nodded weakly and said, "You've come to your senses. You're lucky. We barely pumped you out. Your friend Ben is also alive. He's in another room." I felt a little relieved, But fear for my friends stirred up in me again when the guard spoke again. We already talked a little when you regained consciousness. What you said about your friends, about what you saw is... He paused, unable to find words. I tried to explain, but the words stuck in my throat. Everything we went through seemed like a nightmare, unreality. But it was true. I saw their faces, I heard their screams, and I knew they were gone. I closed my eyes, hoping that the darkness would take away my memories, but the images, like an obsession, surfaced in my mind. The doctor entered, breaking the silence. He said that our condition is stable, but it will take time to recover. I hardly heard him. There was only one thought in my head. We had returned after paying a terrible price. Our friends can't be brought back anymore. I knew that my life and Ben's would never be the same again.